So my name is Marcos Ondarra. I'm a journalist of the Objective Media, and I have the honor of interviewing Bjørn Lomborg today within the framework of the first International Forum on Economy, Climate and Energy promoted by the Juan de Mariana Institute. Mr. Lomborg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you first, how did reading Julian Simon's work in the 90s shift your perspective from being a Greenpeace member to becoming let's say, skeptical?
Yeah. So I read Julian Simon. I flipped through a bookstore. He was in Wired magazine, and he was saying, you know what? You think everything with the environment is getting worse. It's not. Go check the data. And if you think about it, now, obviously I'm much later. I used to be sort of a Greenpeace guy. I wasn't out on a rubber boat, but I was a member of Greenpeace. I wore the batches on my backpack. I had the big poster at home, that kind of thing. And like most people, I just got the sense that the environment was getting worse and worse. But what Julian Simon was saying was, well, if you actually look at the data, it's obvious that many things are getting better. Take air pollution, which is by far the biggest environmental problem in terms of how many people die. Air pollution in rich countries have gotten better and better, at least for the last 30 or 40 years. If you look at the best data that we have for London, London air pollution looks like this from 1585. It just got worse and worse and worse up till about 1890. And since then, air pollution in London has gone down so that today air pollution is better than it's ever been since medieval times. This is a very basic point of data. But remember, what you hear about environment is always, oh, but there's still this problem or there's that problem. So what Julian Simon got me sort of attuned to was the idea that media's job is not to tell you the true state of the world. Media's job is to tell you what's the worst thing that happened in the last 24 hours. Yeah. And that they're very good at, but it doesn't inform you very well. Now, he said one thing, so I was teaching statistics back in university at that point, and he said, go look at the data. And that was exactly what I was teaching my students, right? I mean, I was also trying to sell them to do statistics. But we have one sense of what the world looks like. But the data is there to actually make you realize is that also true.
So what did the data tell you?
So the data tells you that overall, on most environmental problems, we have fixed a lot of problems in the rich world. So we're afforesting, or we're getting more forest because we like forest and we can afford it. We have less air pollution, we have less water pollution. We have fixed most of our environmental problems. We have better biodiversity protection. This is not true in poor countries. But remember, poor countries have much more important issues to deal with. If your kids are dying from easily curable infectious diseases, that's your main priority, not whether you're cutting down rainforest in Brazil. So what we're seeing globally is as you get richer, you start worrying more about environment and you start fixing more of environment. Now, this is not true for climate change. As you get richer, we actually emit more CO2. So I'm assuming we'll get back to that.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, most environmental problems in rich countries are getting better. And for poor countries, as they're getting out of poverty, also increasingly start saying, we want to take care of the environment and deal with their environmental problem.
The, let's say, mainstream discourse about environment shifted from global warming to climate change. Why is that?
So there's this conspiracy theory that that's because global warming is only one thing. It's about temperature, and climate change can be anything. But in reality, it was always climate change in much of the academic conversation. Most of the important bit of climate change is that temperatures rise, and that's still there. But yes, because there's a lot of things that change, it has become a little bit of this, oh, if it's too wet, or if it's too dry, or if it's flooding, or if it's fires or no fires, or anything can be justified as climate change, and that's just bad journalism, I think, more than anything else. Fundamentally, climate change is not a rubbery concept, but we have made it into this, anything that happened was because of climate change, and that's, of course, just silly.
Is global warming mainly human caused?
I think so. Again, remember, I'm a social scientist, so I work with economics. So I just listen to all of the climate scientists who've looked at this for a very long time. They tell us, yes, climate change is real, and I think that's absolutely true. They also tell us the majority of the climate change that we've seen is caused by man, and I have no reason to not believe that.
So you accept human-caused
Yes.
global warming, but you argue the panic-driven policies which are costly and ineffective. How does that make you a denier?
I'm not a denier. I think what happens here is that we've gotten this one way of talking about climate change. So climate change is real, it is a problem, but somehow it's become to say, no, you have to say it's the end of the world. Remember, there's a survey, an OECD survey a couple of years ago that asked people across the rich world, what is the chance of humankind going extinct from climate change, from unmitigated climate change? And 60% said it was likely or very likely. 60% of all rich people, 6 out of 10 people that you will see on the street, believes that climate change will lead to the end of mankind. And that's just wrong. That's not what the UN climate panel tells us. They publish this many reports every 6 or 7 years. I don't encourage you to read them. They're very boring. But they're very good in the sense that they really try to tell you everything we know about climate change. Yes, it's a problem. No, it's not the end of the world. Again, there's a reason why this has become the driving argument, because if this is the end of the world, you should pay everything and all the things to fix this one problem. If it's one problem among many, of course you have to start thinking about, well, how much will this cost? How much good will it do? Is there other things we could spend our money on? So I understand why we have gotten to the point where everybody says, this is the end of the world, give me all your money. But it's not a very good way to have a conversation either about spending money well on climate or remembering that there are many other problems in the world.
Is there a business built around climate change?
Of course there is. But again, we just to remember, every NGO in any area will tell you, here's a big crisis, give us money, right? I mean, if you ask healthcare people, they will tell you, oh, if you don't give us more money to the healthcare sector in Spain, we're all going to be waiting in long lines. Or, if you don't give more money to the teachers, your kids won't be educated. Well, everybody will tell you we need more money. The reason why we need outsiders, I would argue like me, is because we want to know what's the real state of this. And what the evidence shows is there is a problem, but lots of the solutions that you're being sold will actually cost much, much more than the benefit that they will do for climate. And that's a problem, partly because you're wasting your money, but also partly because it scares everyone witless, and partly because it, of course, makes all the other problems we also needed to fix harder to fix.
When they normally talk about the experts in climate change, they normally talk about the members of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Are they really experts? There is indeed a scientific consensus about climate change.
So there's no government organization that's perfect. So I'm not going to go out and say, yes, they're all absolute experts. And I think they've done some mistakes here and there. But fundamentally, yes, these guys have tried to tell us in the best possible way of all the knowledge we have what is likely to happen with climate change. So they tell you we're going to see higher sea levels, we're going to see more higher temperatures, we're going to see more heat waves. Crucially, we're also going to see fewer cold waves, and you rarely hear that. But they tell you all of these things, and I would take most of it as, yes, this is the best we know as mankind. What they don't talk about is, what should we do, and how much is it going to cost, and what is the benefit? They basically decided they were not going to do that back in 1998 at a decision at the IPCC. Why? Because the climate economics don't tell, if you will, the right story. And so they decided we're not going to go down that route, because what the climate economics tell us is you should do cheap stuff that does a lot of good. You shouldn't do expensive stuff that does little good, which is kind of obvious. but it doesn't lead to much of what is implied in much of the conversation on climate change, namely that we should go all solar and wind and net zero and all these things, which are actually often very, very poor policies.
So we could talk about solutions right now, if you,
Yes,
if you
please.
like. Many current climate policies are criticized in your work as low return. So what smarter, higher impact approaches to climate change should we invest instead?
So I'm going to take the implicit question first, because I need to talk about why the things we're doing currently don't work before I want to talk about
the low return.
Yes. So right now, Europe has sort of set itself up and say, we are going to do everything we can to go net zero by 2050. And remember, we somehow believe that we are going to be inspiring the rest of the world to do the same. But nobody looks at Spain or Germany and say, yes, I would love expensive energy and deindustrialization and high debts and less jobs. Nobody is looking at that. Most countries in the rest of the world look at China and say, yes, I would love to have lots of energy and lift lots of people out of poverty, mostly driven by coal. What we need to do is not do this as a virtue signaling in Europe, because remember, nothing what we do will have much of an impact even in 100 years. What we do to convince everyone else to go net zero or cut their carbon emissions or go green is what would really make the difference. So right now we're focused so much on getting Europe to do smarter stuff, to do more green stuff. And that turns out to be fairly expensive, and it'll have very little impact. Just to give you one example, if all of the rich countries in the world go net zero by 2050, so that is not just the EU, but also Australia and Canada and New Zealand, but crucially also the US, which it doesn't look likely right now. But let's assume that all of that happens. Run that in the UN climate model and run it against what would happen if we just continued current policy. The difference by the end of the century is 0.1. It's a little bit less than 0.1 degree centigrade difference. So in 100 years, you won't be able to tell the difference. And that's because Europe and the US is just not the main emitters in the 21st century. That's China, India, Africa, Indonesia, Brazil, so on. This is all the rest of the world that's going to be emitting most of these CO2 gases. What we need to do is to convince them to not start using as much fossil fuels. We're only going to be able to do that if we find a cheaper way to be green. So right now we've focused a lot on subsidizing in order to get solar and wind, but that is probably never what's going to mostly work for the world. What we need to do is invest a lot more into green energy research and development. If we could innovate a green energy source to be cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone would switch, right? So take, for instance, fourth generation nuclear. So there's a lot of people arguing the next generation, maybe small modular reactors, will be so cheap that it'll just win over everyone. The crucial bit is, if that's true, then of course everyone is going to switch. We're not going to need a COP 2031 or COP 32 and so on to twist everybody's arms to do this. They will just do it because it's cheaper. The beautiful thing of this is innovation costs a lot less than putting up lots and lots of solar panels or wind turbines subsidized right now. So we should be focusing on investing in innovation. We are actually arguing, and there was, I don't know if you know, but at the sidelines of the Paris Agreement and back in 2015, where everybody promised to do stuff that we still haven't done, but there was a sideline meeting where Obama and Bill Gates and many other rich country and also Xi Jinping and many others turned up and promised to double the spending in green energy research and development. We played a very small part in this, and that was great. But because we've been so focused on cutting carbon emissions and putting up more solar panels and wind turbines, we haven't actually achieved that. So we focused too much on the expensive Paris Agreement and forgot about the cheap version that would do much more good. So instead of doing these incredibly expensive subsidizing solar and wind, which doesn't really inspire the rest of the world, we should be focusing on making green energy cheaper. That could be nuclear, fourth generation. It could also be fusion. It could be geothermal. It could be solar and wind with lots of batteries and try to get them to be cheaper. There are many other opportunities, but we should be investing in green energy R&D, because that way we can eventually get everyone to switch once we find a technology that's cheaper.
This is actually really interesting, and it connects with my next question. I don't know if you know this, but earlier this year, Spain suffered a blackout. Actually,
everyone heard about that.
Okay, it happened last April, actually. Reports indicate that at the time of the blackout, renewables supplied over 60–80% of the grid's power of Spain, with low contributions from gas or nuclear. What could we learn about this blackout?
So I think there's two things. One is obviously we need to know if this was caused by solar and wind. I seem to find that there's a lot of arguments that suggest that, but it's also very clear the current government in Spain wanted very badly this not to be the case, and we still haven't gotten the final report. Remember, the first 20 seconds, it was only solar and wind that cut out. So that sort of suggests, yes, it probably has part of the problem. But I think in some ways, this is a roundabout way of having the conversation. So first of all, you can't have a situation where you are reliant on power that could disappear at any moment, right? If the wind stopped blowing, if the sun stopped shining, that could be clouds, and certainly at night it stops, very predictably stops shining. That is not a predictable way of running an economy. And so what you really need is backup power. And that's why we see that universally there are no countries that have lots of solar and wind and have low electricity prices. You have lots of countries with much solar and wind and high energy prices. That seems to suggest that the very basic point of saying, if you want power 24/7, but solar and wind only provides it sometimes, you need expensive backup power, either in terms of batteries and typically in backup power of all of the power. So you basically need two systems. That's why it ends up being expensive. And there's no good way out of this. Now, if you can make solar and wind much, much cheaper and make batteries much, much cheaper, maybe you can get out of it, but we're nowhere near that right now. And so I think the blackout, in some sense, sure, there's some academic interest in this, and there's some bragging rights, either if it was caused by solar and wind or not. And obviously you can sort of see where people are going with this. But the much bigger problem is that it's just not cost effective. And this, of course, is why energy prices in Europe have gone up dramatically. I mean, on average, energy prices have doubled in Europe, whereas they've almost not gone up in the US. And they've gone slightly down in China. The point here is we're not going to be able to be competitive. We're not going to be able to keep our living standards improving as long as we say, no, we're going to have unreliable but expensive power.
So, but we live in a world of limited resources. So how do we balance immediate crisis like poverty or disease with long-term ones like climate change?
So my approach to this, and this is just my argument, is that we need to constantly ask what's the cost and what's the benefit. This is called cost-benefit analysis in economics, not surprisingly. And this is how ordinary people work all the time. We all have this situation, oh, I'd love to go on a vacation, but my house needs repairs, and oh, the car is not quite working, and I need to improve the garden. There are all these kinds of things. We don't do everything because we can't afford everything, so we make sort of an estimate, how much good is this going to do and how much is it going to cost, and try to do the best things first. That's how we all operate. We need to do that also in a government sense. We need to have our governments do the same approaches. They don't. Right now, they're looking at what creates the most headlines, what gets me the most votes. And I get why that happens. But let's get a little bit more of the, where can I spend the money in the smartest possible way? So we should fix all big problems in the world in the long run. We fix climate change much cheaper, so about 5% of the current cost and much, much less of what we're predicting we'll have to spend in the future by focusing on green R&D. That's the way we're going to fix climate change. Then, of course, there are many other problems. If you think about the world, there's about 1 billion and 1.5 billion people who live in worlds like ours, that are rich, that live in worlds where most disease has been conquered, and we have good food, and there's a lot of things we don't have to worry about. Many people, more than 4 billion people on this planet, mostly worry about these very basic things, that their kids might die from easily curable infectious diseases, that they don't have enough food, that they don't get good education, that they don't have jobs, there's corruption, all these other things. Very basic, simple things that we've forgotten. And so in Europe, we sit a little bit like, you know what, all these people, I'm going to help them by changing the temperature in 100 years by 0.1 degree. No, they need help with very simple, basic things like malaria, tuberculosis, good education, better nutrition, these very simple things. It turns out that many of these things, for very little money, we can do an amazing amount of good. So I've worked with more than 100 of the world's top economists, several Nobel laureates, where we tried to look at all of the global promises that the world has made and see where can we do the most good for every euro spent. It turns out that there are 12 amazing solutions. So for instance, fix malaria with more bed nets, fix tuberculosis, the world's biggest infectious disease, by getting more testing and better medication. These are very simple, cheap things. There's much, much better ways than we're currently doing in getting small kids better educated, learn them to read and write and do basic arithmetic. Remember, 80% of 10-year-olds, so that's about 1/3 of 1 billion kids, don't know how to read and write and do basic arithmetic. That's no way to live in the 21st century. We know how to do this very cheaply. Why don't we look at some of these very simple basic strategies and fix those as well? Again, I'm not trying to say don't do climate, but do climate cheaply so that we can also fix all the other problems. And then, of course, if you think in a European context, we have many other issues. We also have a pension crisis. We have a war going on. We have, we're often running out of finances. We don't have enough tax, and we spend too much money. We have immigration. There are all kinds of other problems. I'm not going to claim that I have good solutions to all of them, but by making smarter decisions and spending money smarter, we will be much better able to deal with many of them. So this is a way forward. I'm not saying we have the full mapped out, but we have much smarter ways. If we stop wasting a lot of money on policies that'll do almost no good, leaving us with very little money for all the other challenges.
Looking forward to 2030 and even beyond to 2050 right now, what would be the one smart decision that would make the biggest difference in climate change?
So that's undoubtedly going to be innovation. So if you think about how has the world handled other problems in the past, I don't know if you've read about back in late 1960s, early 1970s, a lot of people worried about the world basically not being able to produce enough food. So we thought, India was screwed. We thought China was screwed. We thought, most developing countries were just going to have, huge starvation catastrophes. Back then, had we sort of made the climate approach to this solution, we would have said, you know what, everybody got to get together and you and I and everybody else have to eat less and then we'll send some of the food down to India or China or whatever. That, of course, would not have worked. It doesn't work to tell everyone in an electorate, do you mind being a little poor and a little hungrier? No, that doesn't work. What did work back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, was we dramatically increased investment in green R&D, but a different kind of green, namely agricultural R&D. We just simply made yields much higher. We found a way, so one of the things was we made dwarf varieties of pretty much everything. So instead of the wheat growing up and growing really high and then making a few seeds, it would grow much less. And then it would put more of its energy into many more seeds. So basically, in about 10 years, we managed to double or triple the amount of food we got from every hectare. That's how we save people from starving. That's why India is no longer a basket case, but India is actually the world's leading rice exporter in the world. Because we did technology, because we did R&D. That's how we've solved pretty much all big problems. We haven't solved them by telling everyone, do you mind being poor? We've done it by making sure that technology means we're all better off. That's how we should do it in climate. So if we're smart about climate, we need to invest a lot more into green energy research and development, make the next generations of energy technology so much cheaper that everyone will just buy them. Instead of making this as it has been for the last 30 years. I'm sorry, would you mind being poor? Then I will also be a little poor, and then maybe we can also get Japan along and be a little poor, and then we'll all be a little poor and we'll have cut carbon. That's not going to work. All that we'll do is eventually we'll run out of money in Europe and we'll end up electing someone like Donald Trump. Bad choices, right? Let's try to be smarter about this instead.
So, Mr. Lomborg, thank you so much for your time. It's been an honor.
Thank you.